All right, I will start over. So Hare Krishna, and welcome to the Avatāra series. We are now arrived at part number 8, and today we will hear about the appearance and the pastimes of Ṛṣabhadeva. Ṛṣabhadeva is Vishnu Avatāra, means a plenary expansion of the Lord, not in the category of Jiva. Unlike King Prithu, whom we discussed last time, he was an empowered living entity and counts as a partial representation of Vishnu Shakti. Ṛṣabhadeva's pastimes are to be found in the 5th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and we speak of Maharaj Yudhisthira. That means he is also a king. Krishna uses to appear in the line of Kshatriyas, or like the kingly class, since it is the duties of the king to preserve Vedic knowledge and culture, because they govern, they rule, and their duty is in the first place to protect Dharma, to protect the Brahmins who live Dharma, who teach Dharma. They are guided by the Brahmins. So often it happens that the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, also become very Brahminical, since they have a strong leaning toward the Brahmins in terms of being instructed in transcendental knowledge. And there's mention of Raja Rishis, saintly kings. One of the saintly kings we probably know best is Maharaj Yudhisthira. His story is to be found in the Mahabharata, the great epic, in which we find also the Bhagavad Gita, which is the heart piece of the Mahabharata. And the purpose of the appearance of Ṛṣabhadeva is, for once, that he shows how to perfectly execute religious principles or duties, but also to please his devotee Maharaj Nabi. Ṛṣabhadeva appeared in the family of Maharaj Nabi and his wife Meru. Kings, as I said, have a duty to preserve and to maintain, so they of course have to be concerned with offspring, and the kingly class is a class that has, under certain circumstances, a low life expectancy, since there might be wars, there might be challenges in which they might lose their life, also in the name of duty, as we see also now soldiers if they go to battle. So you never know. So they tend to have also several wives for the purpose of having rather many sons. The emphasis is on sons, since it's like in the Vedic culture tradition, the male offspring, I would say, occupies the throne and will rule the kingdom. So Maharaj Nabi also was in that position. He wanted, of course, to have a son, and it wasn't happening yet that he received a son. And it's also common that then the Kshatriyas, or like the kings, they go through the Brahmins, and the Brahmins, they make a sacrifice. So in order to facilitate that, a king begets sons by the blessings of the Yajna. And of course, the Yajna means to worship Vishnu. And the Brahmins worshipped Vishnu successfully, and Vishnu appeared in the sacrificial arena of Maharaj Nabi. And we will hear more about that just in a second. And in connection to this event of Vishnu appearing in the arena, Maharaj Nabi receiving a son, and in the whole, narration of the pastimes, I would like also to discuss, for those of you who are on Facebook, please also enter your comments or sharings in the chat. Otherwise, those who are on Zoom, please feel free to enter the discussion. We will discuss spiritual material desires. This topic comes up because the Brahmins will argue in a sense that, in a way that make look Maharaj Nabi not so good. He's rather being criticized for his motive behind the Yajna. Later on, we will also discuss more about the distinction between material and spiritual body. This is very relevant, since also in the pastime of Ṛṣabhadeva, he makes a strong emphasis on understanding that what is a transcendental body and a material body. Also, we will discuss the difference between material madness, where it comes from and what it means, and spiritual madness, because we will hear that, unless you know this already, but if you don't know, you might be a bit astonished and shocked what the yoga process looked like that Ṛṣabhadeva was practicing. So we will discuss also this, what is the spiritual madness and how to distinguish these things, because externally it might, of course, look the same. So as I already said, the Yajna performance was successful, and Vishnu appeared in the arena. And I share a picture with you. Do you see that? I guess you will see that, or yeah, it's on. You see here how Vishnu enters the arena on Garuda, and down there left you see the sacrificial fire, and there Maharaj Nabi, or King Nabi, and his wife Meru very happily receiving Vishnu. And of course, as it is common, the Brahmins, they offered prayers. And I just have to get shortly a bit here into this one. Right. First of all, let's hear a bit more of the appearance of Lord Vishnu, because when we hear about the appearance, we always get a lot of detail that helps us visualize the transcendental beautiful form of the Lord. And it is intended that the readers of the Srimad Bhagavatam, all those who listen, that they are able to meditate upon the Lord and in detail in order to connect internally with the Lord. And in the 5th canto, 3rd chapter, we find in the 3rd verse, someone there has his microphone on, please mute yourself. So Lord Vishnu appeared before King Nabi with 4 arms. He was very bright, and he appeared to be the best of all personalities. Around the lower portion of his body, he wore a yellow silken garment. On his chest was the mark of Srivatsa, which always displays beauty. He carried a conch shell, lotus flower, disc, and club. He wore a garland of forest flowers and the Kaustubha gem. He was beautifully decorated with a helmet, earrings, bangles, belt, pearl, necklace, armlets, ankle belts, and other bodily ornaments, bedecked with radiant jewels. Seeing the Lord present before them, King Nabi and his priests and associates felt just like poor people who have suddenly attained great riches. They received the Lord and respectfully bent their heads and offered him things in worship. So we can see that the effect of seeing Vishnu is accompanied with great opulence. That means a person who sees Vishnu alone, like in his opulence, as it said here, feels like a poor person who suddenly received great riches. It's the ultimate benediction. And we hear of several personalities who express in their prayers when they see the Lord that they feel completely satisfied and might even regret that they wished for something else than only seeing the Lord. Because within the Lord, everything that is desirable is manifest in its features. So also the Brahmins, of course, offered prayers to King Nabi. And then they said something very interesting, or like they made remarks that appear perhaps a bit, it could be considered it's offensive toward King Nabi, since he was a bit, how to say, he was criticized in front of the Lord, so to speak, although he was the king and he arranged for the sacrifice so that Vishnu appeared. And let's hear about that a bit more. Stop this here. So we find that the Brahmins said the following. In the 3rd chapter, text 13, they say, "Dear Lord, here is the great King Nabi, whose ultimate goal in life is to have a son like you. Your lordship, his position is like that of a person approaching a very rich man and begging for a little grain. Maharaj Narvi is so desirous of having a son that he is worshipping you for a son, although you can offer him any exalted position, including elevation to the heavenly planets or liberation back to Godhead. So let's look a bit closer on the considerations the Brahmins offer here, or like express here. They say King Nabi is actually not very intelligent, and they felt obviously somewhat embarrassed to call the Lord for the sake of providing King Nabi a son, but not just a son. He wished for a son like Vishnu or like you. And they compared this desire to asking a rich man for a little grain. And then they offered another perspective where they say, besides such desire, you could fulfill others like any exalted position, elevation to the heavenly planets. They considered more worthy of a desire or liberation back to Godhead. So they place these two types of desires in contrast to the desire of having a son. On the other hand, we can imagine if Maharaj Narvi would go without a son, if he would be in a situation not having a son, well, they would bring up the issue of, hey, you don't have a son. And since you are a king, you're supposed to have sons because you have to secure the line. So it's kind of ironic that a king, in one sense, he can't, in this regard, he can only do wrong. If he desires a son, he is guilty of desiring something material for benefit of his material life. If he would not have a son not wanted, he would be neglectful of his duty to provide a son for rulership. Of course, there's a difference if he wants the son more for himself, saying, I want to be father and enjoy fatherhood, or do I want the son like Vishnu even, so for being a king. It will turn out that his desire actually was the most beneficial desire for everyone. Because let's think of it, if Vishnu himself takes the role of being the king of the world, Vaikuntha will manifest, because this is what's happening when Vishnu is present and all his opulences manifest, his will be there, and so everything will turn into Vaikuntha. So actually his desire is very good, but in general this desire is considered not so elevated. He says in two verses later, just give me a second. In text number 15, they say further, O Lord, you perform many wonderful activities. Our only aim was to acquire a son by performing this great sacrifice. Therefore, our intelligence is not very sharp. Thus they admit, or like they regret to have performed the sacrifice with that motive. They say further, we are not experienced in ascertaining life's goal. By inviting you to this negligible sacrifice for some material motive, we have certainly committed a great offense at your lotus feet. Therefore, O Lord of Lords, please excuse our offense because of your causeless mercy and equal mind. And Srila Prabhupada writes in the purport, the priests were certainly unhappy to have called the Supreme Lord from Vaikuntha for such an insignificant reason. So I would like to discuss with you a bit the issue or topic of spiritual material desires. What such desires are we supposed to have, or what even passes as genuine spiritual desire? I think we all can admit that without desires, we don't move anywhere. If you, in that sense, let's say, materially desire less, so what gives you reason to do anything? Right? You will be there, oh yeah, I'm desireless, I don't intend to want anything, so I'm just sitting and wait that it's over. So like that. So whoever of those present in Zoom or those who are also on the join us on Facebook, if you would like to share some of your thoughts on what are genuine spiritual desires, first of all, or what do you think, what is the distinction between spiritual and material desire? I assume, Dee, do you have a view on the Facebook chat? Because I open it up here and it can go again. Oh yeah, now I see it here.
No, I can't see any comments on there.
Okay, but I see now the stream. Okay, it's good. Do you have any thoughts, Dee, or also here in Kara, like, do you have any thoughts on the matter of spiritual and material desires?
I think spiritual desire could easily be like a desire to serve, you know, or that's how I would see it, you know, the desire to, you know, do bhakti yoga or serve the Lord, or, you know, do something, you know, even if it's not in a bhakti sense, you know, that doesn't give you anything back in return. And I suppose with the material desires, obviously you desire something to satisfy your senses, to, you know, self-gratification purposes, rather than, you know, to serve others, is how I'd see it, like the main difference.
All right. So, okay, one aspect is the selflessness. It's about I serve, I give. So that makes it more of a spiritual desire if it's connected with the Lord. Otherwise, it can also be a humanitarian theoretically, but serve the others. So selflessness and serving. Thank you. Yeah, Hiran, you can unmute yourself and like if you like you share. Yes, kind of.
For the spiritual part of it, the thing is to understand God, to know God, without any desires or without any wishes. That would be a spiritual desire. Whereas materialistic would just be the opposite, or some gain. That's what I figure.
Thank you. So what I understood from what you shared is like to know and understand, or like trying to understand and know God would be spiritual desire, and the material desire rather on the contrary. This is what I got from what I could hear acoustically. All right. Okay. Yes, I want to suggest a few things like spiritual desires that count as spiritual desires are, for example, a desire for having a son like Vishnu, because you would like have a divine personality that can manifest spiritual qualities. It can manifest or like protect spiritual culture. I would consider that like a desire that is basic in its nature, something spiritual, but actually the desire itself does not stand alone. It is, why do I desire it? A desire can also be dovetailed or like within the service of the Lord, like the desire of a son. You might also look at Bhaktivinoda Thakur, his son Bhaktivinoda Saraswati Thakur, as far as if I remember correctly. He also, of course, wanted a son who would be a powerful preacher of the cult of Bhakti or Krishna consciousness. So in that sense, desire of having a son who is a devotee could be also for my sake, that I look good as a father. Oh, I have a nice devotee child or like son or daughter or whatever. So there could be also selfish, not so spiritual, but connected to spiritual. But if I want to have a child that is like becomes a devotee and genuinely benefits everyone, and this is my desire, then I would say it counts as a spiritual desire. But although it's connected to the material world, then there's the desire for liberation. The Brahmins mentioned that in the verse. They said you could be elevated to the heavenly planets, or even going back to Godhead. They contrasted the desire for having a son to a desire like this. And these are also desires that are in the Bhakti tradition. We actually don't, how to say, hear that they are really acknowledged, or like at least they're not validated. Even going back to Godhead, it's still something that usually is looked at as I want something for myself. And here also in the purpose of Srila Prabhupada, in this particular chapter that he points that out, he now also, when the priests express their regrets for having called the Lord for son, he a bit more elaborately speaks on that, how a Vaishnava never actually wants to see the Lord for the purpose of his own needs be fulfilled whatsoever. And that he never wants to, so to say, bother the Lord with that. I think we can maybe fill in here that, okay, we are not necessarily on the level of pure devotion. So perhaps we can allow ourselves to not expect us to have this very pure desires or like this complete selflessness. We probably will remain on the platform of mixed devotion for a while, be influenced by the modes of nature, and have also on a spiritual level selfish desires, or which could be called self-centered or selfish desires. What, for example, about the desire of enlightenment or spiritual bliss? Is that a spiritual desire? What would you say? Desire for enlightenment, experiencing spiritual bliss, the happiness of the soul, knowing the soul.
That would be spiritual, wouldn't it? Unless you have what's the word, other vested interests, as in, it's a very opulent place and, I can gratify all my senses. If you think from it that way, I suppose, then it becomes more material. I think, does it not at the end fall to why you want it? Like you said, you could ask for a very good preaching son to make yourself look good, or to genuinely for that person to be spreading bhakti. So I think you could even, very pure thing. Maybe somebody say, oh, give me the opportunity to serve so I could, shine, in front of the devotee community. Then that's exactly not, if they wanted to be the center stage and that's why they wanted to serve, then that's not exactly spiritual, is it?
Right. Yeah, then we become servants of our ego, so to speak. The ego wants to have recognition and admiration or being confirmed. Yes. Right. So the desire is dependent on also the motive, of course. It's generally considered, even the most pure devotees, they don't even want to experience the spiritual ecstasies that go along with self-realization. I must admit, I would be happy to even come close to this kind of symptoms of spiritual ecstasies, to experience them and then consider, okay, I want to bypass them because they hinder me, but I'm not even there to experience them or to speak of leaving them behind. So on my platform, I would rather find that a worthwhile desire, because it will move me, certainly elevate me more from what I seek in a mature world in terms of happiness and knowledge. That would be a way higher aim and more connected to my spiritual interest. Because where is spiritual bliss coming from? Actually from established consciousness that I see myself belonging to the Supreme Lord, that I'm a spirit soul different from the body, and I have a relationship of service. And Srila Prabhupada also describes in the Nectar of Devotion, when it is about submission and surrender, there's in the, I have to find the chapter again, but he speaks of also the desire of being reinstated in one's constitutional position. And he speaks about it saying, this is nothing to do actually with sense gratification. Because let's consider constitutional position means in a purified state, as a pure soul, being established in your eternal service relationship with the Lord in the spiritual world where we belong. That's actually the most natural desire for any soul. Why would you not desire that? Because now we are not situated in that position, and we try to practice becoming servants of the Lord. But what is the ultimate aim? Ultimately, to be free from all false identities and be back in our real identity, whatever this might be on a spiritual platform. So I think this we should also have in mind when we speak of these desires, to not kind of try to skip desires we're not even aware of what they actually mean for our spiritual life, right? There are desires like seeing the Lord, like the Brahmins now said, okay, We don't want to see you unnecessary just for purposes like that. It must be something significant. We don't want to bother you. That's more the mood of a devotee. He says, since I'm a servant, I don't want to employ you, my Lord, in fulfilling my desires. That's the mood of a devotee. But at the same time, a devotee is happy to see the Lord. That's why also the Lord comes and reveals his pastimes. He says that Paritanaya Sadhunam, and Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur explains that the Lord likes to please the devotees by showing his forms, by showing his pastimes, like also Ṛṣabhadeva. All right. So yeah, this was a little excursion into spiritual desires. Another desire we might also consider for the end of that is the desire for association of Guru and Vaishnava. These are desires that are actually desirable, desires we actually should have. To be in contact with Vaishnavas who inspire us, who uplift us, who can enlighten us, and in this way bring us further on the path, because out of our own self simply, we're not capable to just attain self-realization or go back to Godhead. So that would be something also to consider, that such desires are actually wanted. And that we also see desires give us drive in our spiritual life, our inspiration. If we look at that, what inspires me in my process of bhakti? And on the core, we find some desire, like, because we have to, in a conditioned state also, if you're not situated in transcendental self-satisfaction, there's something we need to hold on to that we can achieve or get, so that we have a drive. This might be even enlightenment, that might be spiritual bliss and happiness, might be being established in a certain type of service, or finding one's deity to worship and whatever. So these are, I would consider, genuine desires that are needed for those who are not on the path or the platform of pure devotional service. All right, so then they offered the prayers, and Vishnu told them that he was pleased, and he responded to the sages saying, "Oh, great sages, I'm certainly very pleased with your prayers. You are all truthful. You have prayed for the benediction of a son like me for King Nabi, but this is very difficult to obtain. Since I'm the supreme person without a second, and since no one is equal to me, another personality like me is not possible to find. In any case, because you're all qualified Brahmins, your vibration should not prove untrue. I consider Brahmanas who are very well qualified with Brahminical qualities to be as good as my own mouth. Since I cannot find anyone equal to me, I shall personally expand myself into a plenary portion, and thus advent myself in the womb of Meru-Devi, the wife of Maharaj Nabi, the son of Agnidara." So in this way, Sri Vishnu decided to enter into this world and become the son of Maharaj Nabi and Meru-Devi in the name Ṛṣabhadeva. The name Ṛṣabhadeva means the best of all people. And it will be explained in later verses how he got to this name, because he manifested all the good qualities and the opulences of the Supreme Lord, and automatically excelled as a being in terms of character, personality, qualities. And this is why called Ṛṣabha, the best of all personalities. So he descended like this in order to preach and show perfect execution of religious principles as a king. In the 4th chapter, we find a bit also the symptoms of the Lord, which is interesting to have in mind, because last time we also spoke that whenever Vishnu appears, he has particular characteristics on his body. We hear about the parents, we hear about the place and the time, and Ṛṣabhadeva appeared at the end of either a given or like the past Dvapara Yuga. We will hear later that actually the Kali Yuga started, and there were people who imitated Ṛṣabhadeva and were actually irreligious people. So it must be by logic, you must conclude he was kind of at the end of Dvapara Yuga, he was present. And as described here in the 4th chapter, as soon as the Lord was born as the son of Maharaj Nabi, he manifested symptoms of the Supreme Lord, such as marks on the bottoms of his feet, the flag, thunderbolt, etc. So these are there the symptoms how to recognize the form of the Lord. This son was equal to everyone and very peaceful. He could control his senses and his mind, and possessing all opulence, he did not hanker for material enjoyment. Endowed with all these attributes, the son of Maharaj Nabi became more powerful day after day. Due to this, the citizens, learned brahmanas, demigods, and ministers wanted Ṛṣabhadeva to be appointed ruler of the earth. When the son of Maharaj Nabi became visible, he evinced all good qualities described by great poets, namely a well-built body with all the symptoms of the Godhead, prowess, strength, beauty, name, fame, influence, and enthusiasm. When the father, Maharaj Nabi, saw all these qualities, he thought his son to be the best of human beings or the supreme being. Therefore, he gave him the name Ṛṣabha. So here we have again this Shastric explanation. What is his name? What does his name mean? The best of human beings or the supreme being, Ṛṣabhadeva. So the king was so satisfied and qualified and with his son, and also the people in general, that the king was happy to install him quite early, actually, on the throne. And Maharaj Nabi withdrew to the Himalaya mountains, to the ashram of Naranara and Narishi. This is a very famous place where many kings or like persons withdraw in order to attain spiritual perfection. And they worship Naranara and Narishi there in a deity form. And King Ṛṣabhadeva became the ruler, but not immediately. His intention was to teach the people by example the perfect Vedic culture, which means one ashram a dharma, going through the whole process of being trained systematically in Vedic knowledge and also performing the duties of a given ashram. So there must, according to the description, there must have been some time where some ministers or like, how to say, proxy kings kind of would have taken over. Because Ṛṣabhadeva first is described after his father retired. He entered Brahmachari ashram, although this is done very early in life, usually from like 5 to 25. So, and he was trained by a guru in a Gurukula. And after completing this training, being well equipped with transcendental knowledge, he entered the Grihastha ashram or household ashram. And then he also got married. And his wife's name, just give me a second. Yeah, Jayanti, Ṛṣabhadeva Jayanti. They got together and they had 100 sons all in all. It's described also that such a glorious personality who is like perfectly executing those religious principles and has very opulent characteristic mystic power and performs also yagyas. This is always something that threatens certain personalities and the heavenly planets. And guess who got envious on Ṛṣabhadeva? Our old friend King Indra, as he often also, Prithu Maharaj, he got envious when Prithu Maharaj performed his 100 Ashwamedha sacrifices. He got envious on Krishna when he induced people to not worship Indra but Govardhan Hill. In case of in regards to Krishna, he caused incessant rain. It didn't stop raining, and Krishna lifted then the Govardhan Hill as an umbrella and protected all the devotees of Vrindavan. In case of King Ṛṣabhadeva, Indra withheld all rain. But Ṛṣabhadeva was not at all disturbed and took it also as an opportunity to manifest his divine powers, and he let it rain by his own mystic opulence. So he was not dependent on Indra. So how humiliating is that if you try to really exhibit some power and think, now I close your, how to say, channel of water and opulence, but then it doesn't matter because this person can by itself make it rain. Like, yeah. So there's also this mentioned in between how Indra again got envious, but Ṛṣabhadeva just wasn't bothered by it because he was very opulent himself. So Ṛṣabhadeva and Jayanti, they begot 100 sons, and the eldest son was Bharat. And this is the Bharat we also know, after whom the earth was named Bharatavarsha, who later in the 5th canto we hear Jada Bharat, the whole story, the one who also took birth as a deer because he got attached to a deer. So he comes in the line of King Nabi, meaning being the son of Ṛṣabhadeva. And there are 18 more sons mentioned as the elderly sons. 9 of them became great devotees and authorized preachers, and 81 of those sons became very qualified Brahmins. So in this way also, Ṛṣabhadeva showed how, like, being successful or very successful as a Kshatriya householder, he had sons who all were well established in Vedic culture and principles, and they performed duties. And although Ṛṣabhadeva himself was very accomplished in Vedic knowledge, very enlightened, and actually had no bodily conception anymore, he still remained in this ashram, it is explained, in order to teach others, performing the sacrifices and so on. So, and at some point, of course, it was time for him also to rather give his sons the opportunity to rule. And we should note that when he appeared, everything is very opulent. Vishnu is there, and he manifests with symptoms of Vishnu, becomes his name, indicating he is the best of all human beings and persons. The whole kingdom was very satisfied with him, acknowledging him as the most saintly and powerful king, Vishnu himself. And we will hear there will be a very dramatic switch when Maharaj Ṛṣabhadeva left his grihastha life. It is very astonishing what happened then. So we hear in the 5th chapter that Maharaj Ṛṣabhadeva, he instructed his sons in transcendental knowledge. It's a whole chapter. It includes a lot of philosophical points, a lot of ethical and religious arguments that are being made. Like a short summary, essentially he points out, okay, human life is meant for self-realization. If one simply tries to satisfy his senses and not paying any attention or not giving importance to self-realization, one wastes one's life, one is considered an animal, and human life would be a failure. This is one of the core messages. To understand human life is so precious because it offers the opportunity of self-realization, and one should use it as such. Also then the so-called fruitive activities are condemned, saying they just lead to downfall. Ultimately, one entangles oneself into the material conception of life. And he highlights the difference between spiritual and material body. Also, this is something we could discuss. He also describes to his own sons his transcendental body. He says, my transcendental body looks exactly like a human form, but it is not a material human body. It is inconceivable. I am not forced by nature to accept a particular type of body. I take on a body by my own sweet will. My heart is also spiritual, and I always think of the welfare of my devotees. Therefore, within my heart can be found the process of devotional service, which is meant for the devotees. Far from my heart have I abandoned irreligion and non-devotional activities. They do not appeal to me. Due to all these transcendental qualities, people generally pray to me as Ṛṣabhadeva, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the best of all living entities. Let's have again maybe a short discussion on material and spiritual body. What is your understanding? What is the essential difference between these two? also those on Facebook. If there's any, you might also feel free to share. We can just, yeah, I hardly hear you. You have to speak up.
The spiritual body is indestructible, whereas the material body is destructible. That's what I see the way to think.
Yes, thank you. I could not fully understand. You used one term, but acoustically I didn't get it.
The spiritual body
Mm-hmm.
is indestructible, whereas the material body is destructible.
Did you get it? Like acoustically? Okay. Anyway, probably we might touch your point. Thank you though for sharing. Would you sound like
You might
to add
want to
something?
type it, Hiran.
Oh yeah, you can type it in the
I
chat.
thought in terms of, yeah, material body is, I think I'd see it as the gross body, and the spiritual body probably is it the Paramatma? I don't know, maybe.
All right, interesting. Huh? Thank you. Yes, the material body is, of course, what would be. Not destructible. Yes, that's correct. The spiritual body is indestructible, and whereas the material body is destructible. Yes, the material body consists, of course, of the 5 gross elements, and also the subtle body is part of it. For some people, they might equate, or we would say confuse, the subtle body with the spiritual body. Mind, intelligence, and false ego constitute what is called the subtle body. And this is that what carries the soul from actually one gross material body to another. When we leave the gross body, the subtle body remains and stores all the impressions, the consciousness, the knowledge. So therefore, you're also capable to remember past lives, for example, because these things remain there as long as the soul is trapped in material consciousness. Within the subtle body, also certain life airs are there, and they said they actually keep the soul trapped. They're very subtle and powerful, and they keep the soul within this body. So essentially, the characteristic of a material body is that it is temporary, full of ignorance and full of suffering. And Krishna is speaking of his own transcendental body in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where he discusses with Arjuna how he actually, like ages ago, instructed the sun god Vivasvan in the knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita. And Arjuna was wondering, well, how is that possible? Vivasvan is already, I don't know how old, and how could you have been there, since we are just like being present this life? Krishna at the time of the Bhagavad Gita counted 120 years and still looked like a 18-year-old. so that's non-aging body. He's always youthful. And Krishna points out, yes, the thing is, I have been there, you have been there, I can remember it, you don't. And he says this is essentially also the nature of a spiritual body: uninterrupted consciousness, no forgetfulness, because there is no change. He also makes that point. The spiritual body is not changeable. Yes, we will shortly come to the comment. Thank you. So Krishna points out that a spiritual realized person is free from ignorance, or like the spiritual soul, and is conscious. And we can see that in our material life, as long as we're under the influence of a material body, we always have just interrupted consciousness. Latest when we sleep, consciousness is interrupted, or like covered the different levels of wakefulness, sleep, deep sleep, dreamless sleep. We addressed it last time. But the soul is already fully conscious, and Krishna can remember all his appearances because he never changed also his body. Forgetfulness also comes when we change the body. We leave this one and accept the new one, and we must even forget. Otherwise, we have an identity crisis right from the start. Because if you wouldn't forget our old identity, how you bring this together? Although you sometimes can remember your old life. Yeah, please, Steve, what is the comment on Facebook?
Yes, so we've got a comment from Gunas Agree. She says that the material body is the gross body made of material elements like bone, bile, air, mucus, etc., which dies. The spiritual body is eternal and the material body is temporary. I think that's the same point that Hiran made earlier.
Yes, thank you for sharing. Yes, exactly. Let's also explore a bit more. Yes, we have established now, okay, that one is existing eternally, the other one is temporary, and actually is even considered non-existence because the terms sat and asat are used. Sat is that what remains, which is eternal. Asat is that what has no existence, because it in every minute changes. So this is one consideration. We find also in the Brahma Samhita the statement that the limbs of Krishna's transcendental body can fulfill the functions of all other limbs. Angani yasya sakalendriya vrittimanti pasyanti panti kalyanti charam jiganti. Ananda chinmaya sad ushvala vigrahasya govindam adipurusham tamaham bhajami. In many temples, or most temples, we chant one of these shlokas also when we greet the deities. So Angani yasya sakalendriya vrittimanti, all the limbs of Krishna's body can fulfill the functions of all other limbs. Srila Prabhupada also used to say, Krishna can simply eat by looking at the food. He doesn't have to have it in his mouth. As we also see, he can impregnate material nature simply by his glands, sending out the jivas. And so also with his ears, he can do what his eyes do, and so on. All the bodies are, all the limbs are interchangeable, whereas the material body is very conditioned. Only a certain sense can fulfill a certain sensual function, and is conditioned also in terms of how much this can be done. For example, we don't see all the spectrums of how to say, light. Certain light is not visible to us, but to certain insects, for example, or other animals, they see only black and white. So there's always condition, there's limitation, whereas the spiritual body is unconditioned and absolute. And Krishna also says, my body is actually not born, it's manifesting. He shows it is actually there already and he manifests it, whereas the material body is being produced by material energy and then also again reduced to its core elements. So this is important, since this is also something one is supposed to meditate upon in daily life. The Bhagavad Gita also instructs us, na sato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate sataha, ubayo vitarishtantas tvanayos tattvadarshibhihi. This is a verse from the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, 16. Nasato vidyate bhavo. This was what is asat, or non-existence, the material body, and that what is then eternal or like unchangeable, has been ascertained by those who are tattvadarshis as, or like they distinguish from one from the other by the process of studying the nature of both. So we are actually encouraged to become scientists in the sense of the conscious observers of material nature and spiritual nature, and this way create our own possibility to be able to distinguish from one another. Because the more we do that, the more I understand I'm not this body, the more I become free from fear, anxieties, all these kind of things, because it relates only to the material body. And let's get back at that point to Ṛṣabhadeva, because he also makes the point that that his own body is, just give me a second. Own body is free from all sufferings. He said here. Okay, it comes a bit later. That way again addresses this spiritual body. So after having, though, instructed his sons on these matters of transcendental knowledge, he himself retired from being king, and now a drastic change came. And it's described here in the 5th chapter. After accepting the feature of Avadhuta, someone who is not concerned anymore with any social demands or regulations. A great saintly person, so without material cares, Lord Ṛṣabhadeva passed through human society like a blind, deaf, and dumb man, an idle stone, a ghost, or a madman. Although people called him such names, he remained silent and did not speak to anyone. So like now comes the drastic change. In the first place, like this very responsible king and householder who would perform sacrifice, instructed his sons about transcendental knowledge, and now completely shifting to having no connection whatsoever with material life or material, affairs. Is that Ṛṣabhadeva began to tour through cities, villages, mines, countrysides, valleys, gardens, military camps, cowpens, and the homes of colored men, transient hotels, hills, forests, and hermitages. Wherever he traveled, all bad elements surrounded him, just as flies surround the body of an elephant coming from a forest. He was always being threatened, beaten, and now listen to that, urinated upon and spat upon. Sometimes people threw stones, stool, and dust at him, and sometimes people passed foul air before him. So that's very drastic. Like, just imagine this would happen to anyone, or like would speak to yourself. That would be the most humiliating, disturbing experience ever. Why? Because this goes all against all what we believe how a human being or like a person should be treated. And it would be very disturbing because why? Because there is a sense I'm a person, but we have to remark material person to whom certain etiquette, standards, ethics apply. So he had said that people called him many bad names and gave him a great deal of trouble, but he did not care about this, for he understood that the body is simply meant for such an end. He was situated on a spiritual platform, and being in his spiritual glory, he did not care for these material insults. In other words, he completely understood that matter and spirit are separate, and he had no bodily conception. Thus, without being angry at anyone, he walked through the whole world alone. To just contemplate on that. What I was wondering is like, what happened to the king everyone knew? They suddenly could not recognize. I mean, of course, he let his hair grow. He was walking around naked, behaving like a madman. Of course, that makes him hard to recognize. But usually Krishna also employs his yoga maya energy to conceal his transcendental nature. And as described further, Lord Ṛṣabhadeva's hands, feet, and chest were very long. His shoulders, face, and limbs were all very delicate and symmetrically proportionate. His mouth was beautifully decorated with his natural smile, and he appeared all the more lovely with his reddish eyes spread wide like the petals of a newly grown lotus flower covered with dew in the early morning. The irises of his eyes were so pleasing that they removed all the troubles of everyone who saw him. His forehead, ears, neck, nose, and all his other features were very beautiful. His gentle smile always made his face beautiful, so much that he even attracted the hearts of married women. It was as though they had been pierced by the arrows of Cupid. About his head was an abundance of curly matted brown hair. His hair was disheveled because his body was dirty and not taken care of. He appeared as if he were haunted by ghosts. So it's also very interesting combination of what's happening here. On one side, very neglected, dirty, and like appearing like a madman and a ghost. And at the same time, most attractive, capturing the hearts of married women and just take away everyone's troubles by his smile, by his beautiful eyes, and so on. So that's something to have in mind, how Ṛṣabhadeva manifests his features. And then it gets better. When Lord Ṛṣabhadeva saw the general populace was very antagonistic to his execution of mystic yoga, he accepted the behavior of a python in order to counteract their opposition. Thus he stayed in one place and lay down. While lying down, he ate and drank, and he passed stool and urine, and rolled in it. Indeed, he smeared his whole body with his own stool and urine, so that opposing elements might not come and disturb him. So please, children, don't try that at home. It's not meant for you. it's really, in this yoga pass, Ṛṣabhadeva did that. It was something for a very advanced person who really has no intent to be disturbed by anyone. So this is a practice. It's not meant for it's not meant for nowadays for us. I guess no one would be inclined to anyway. That would be considered a behavior of a really mad person. You think, oh, this has nothing to do with spirituality. So, but they were so detached, they would maybe apply such methods to keep people away from them and that they not disturb them. And here it comes, because Ṛṣabhadeva remained in that condition, the public did not disturb him, but no bad aroma emanated from his stool and urine. Quite the contrary, his stool and urine were so aromatic that they filled 80 miles of the countryside with a pleasant fragrance. So that's also very astonishing. You know, this again relates to the transcendental body. There's no impurities, and in the purports of Srila Prabhupada explains that in the spiritual world these things are there, but in a very pure form. There's nothing, there's no disgust, there's nothing dirty, nothing low grade or something. So even his stool is something very aromatic. It smelled like the most aromatic flowers, and in the 80 miles in this area, the smell was there. So that's something very remarkable about the pastimes of Ṛṣabhadeva. So he did like this. And the Python yoga is also something that represents a form of surrender and simplicity. He said, whatever comes by nature, when natural comes to me, I accept. When nothing comes, I also accept. So this very self-satisfaction and ability to renounce, not endeavoring for any material gain. So that's something we can also, to some degree, of course, apply. Try to, whatever comes of its own accord, I accept, but not excessively trying to get so many, either money, success, career, and so on, but rather what comes of its own accord, to accept that and be satisfied. That's one intention. So Ṛṣabhadeva continued that, and later it's also said he took stones in his mouth and walked around like that, and also he ripped out his hairs. And this appeared very, of course, weird to people, but the madman behavior comes also from that in a spiritual body, there is a whole different way of experiencing the self. And actually the material body is also not equipped for full transcendental accesses, but also it becomes irrelevant for the soul. There's no consideration anymore of good and bad, of either appropriate, inappropriate, and whatever. In any case, the body is just what it is, and material interactions don't concern this person anymore. So there's no need to play by certain rules. We are used in our framework. This is how you behave. This is right and wrong. And someone who's completely out of that box, you would consider mad. And this kind of madness is based on transcendental knowledge. I am not this body, I'm a spirit soul. So I don't have to, let's in our language, play ball with all this kind of social customs. And the difference I would like to assert to material madness is that the material madness comes from actually hurt ego. And there's still a strong identification with matter. Let's say a person might fail severely, lose his business or like his job, or family life fails completely. And there's a strong sense of failure and loss and perhaps being treated very unjustly, being very hurt. So then also the mind has the ability to fend off these very painful experiences like disempowerment, humiliation, by going into some state of madness in which the mind somehow or other tries to manage what's happening. And then this madness comes also usually accompanied by intoxication or by kind of being really split inside oneself, and this way being able to distance oneself from regular society and living in one's own kind of world, but it's based on the material false ego. So this way Ṛṣabhadeva passed his life, and it said he actually once went into a forest, and then there was a forest fire. And in this forest fire, he chose to disappear. And Srila Prabhupada explains, of course, his transcendental body did not burn. He just chose to disappear. And said all those creatures living in that forest with him at that time, they also got liberated. Because Vishnu was just there and he took everyone with him. So this way the pastimes of Ṛṣabhadeva conclude. And there is mention that they're like became cheap imitators. I think Jaida, like I have to see the purport again. And a forest fire, where's one? Yeah, it was the king. There was, in the chapter 6, text 9, it said, Shukadeva Goswami continued speaking to Maharaj Parikshit, my dear king, the king of Konka, named Venka and Kutaka. Konka, Venka and Kutaka, whose name was Arhat, heard of the activities of Ṛṣabhadeva and imitating Ṛṣabhadeva's principles, introduced a new system of religion, taking advantage of Kali Yuga, the age of sinful activities. King Arhat, being bewildered, gave up the Vedic principles which are free from risk and concocted a new system of religion opposed to the Vedas. That was the beginning of the Jain Dharma. Many other so-called religions followed from this atheistic system. Yet the Jains, Jain, so these are a group of people who like actually not followers of Ṛṣabhadeva, although they claim, because they completely misrepresent that. They take some of the practices and avoid regular performance of duty and so on. So this is also happening often. Yes, so there we heard Ṛṣabhadeva's appearance, his pastimes as a king, and then the other side, the other half, when he then was a vanaprastha and sannyas. So he went through all these stages in a very impressive way. And so and Srila Prabhupada remarks in one purport that his teachings are relevant for all the 4 yugas, because essentially what he is teaching is the distinction between material body and self. It's relevant in any yuga. He also emphasizes the performance of duty, Varnashram Dharma, although nowadays kind of a difficulty, but still the performance of duty is very relevant. And in general, hearing the glories of the Supreme Lord. So these things are valid no matter what time we live in. Although the practices of Ṛṣabhadeva in his later life should not be imitated, the Yuga Dharma still remains the chanting of the holy names, especially the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, and this way we can attain the same benefits as the practices of different yugas. Hare Krishna. So are there any more comments or questions in regards to Ṛṣabhadeva?
It's interesting because he took, being a Krishna avatar, he took the sort of the idea of austerity and kind of, I suppose, and doing the yajnas and what have you to such an extent as to, putting his hair out and, all that. But isn't there a quote in the Bhagavad Gita that says, a true yogi shouldn't eat too much, eat too less. So the idea that, we shouldn't really, like, I think Jain people, I think they do exist until today. Like, they go like, don't wear clothes. There are also the sadhu sectors that kind of do that extreme. I think some Shivites, the Aghoris, I think I watched a documentary that kind of smother themselves with ashes, then live next to funeral pyres and stuff. So I think that kind of, it's interesting because it kind of almost goes against the teachings, because we're not told that's not the way to do it. It's selfless service. True bhakti yoga is the highest form of yoga, not performing these austerities. So I found that interesting because it's kind of almost a direct contradiction to that Bhagavad Gita quote.
Yes, as you mentioned this, the Jain people, they do not take care of their bodies and do neglect duties, and in this way, they contradict actually the essential principle of serving the divine. And maybe I can add another statement of Srila Prabhupada in a later verse. Well, after that, with the Jains, Srila Prabhupada, or like the verse again, speaks in more elaboration. Yeah, they say they will abandon bathing 3 times daily and worship the Lord, abandoning cleanliness, neglecting the Supreme Lord. They will accept nonsensical principles, not regularly bathing or washing their mouths regularly. They will always remain unclean, and they will pluck out their hair. Following a concocted religion, they will flourish. And then he says that during this age of Kali, this is common that irreligion becomes religion. And Srila Prabhupada in the purport addresses a certain type of people in many places. Since he came to the West, he criticized him quite harshly, and he had a strong, actually, aversion toward the lifestyle. And these are the hippies. He said, presently, the hippies in the Western countries fit this description. They are irresponsible and unregulated. They do not bathe, and they deride standard Vedic knowledge. They concoct new lifestyles and religions. There are many hippie groups at the present moment, but they all originated from King Arhat, who imitated the activities of Lord Ṛṣabhadeva, who was situated on the Paramahansa stage. So we find often that Srila Prabhupada leaves no good hair on the hippies. So it's always quite straight and critical. Yeah. All right. Then I would say we can conclude here. Thanks to all of you for participating, and looking forward. We will certainly have at least one more Avatāra series. We will discuss the Avatāra Kapila Dev, who is very present in the 3rd canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and spoke Sankhya philosophy. It's more like of a topic which is more strongly philosophical, more has to do with logic and analytical approach. Yes, and looking forward to see you there, also you on holistic spirituality. And thanks again for participating, and wishing you a wonderful evening, and Hare Krishna.